So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's program, Yellow Roses, a book launch and celebration of the life and work of Elizabeth Cullinan. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, great. My name's Angela Alaimo O'Donnell. I am the Associate Director of the Curran Center for American Catholic Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this extraordinary event. Co-sponsored by the Curran Center, by Fordham University Press, the Irish Studies Program, and the Gaelic Society. I'm also thrilled to welcome my three distinguished panelists and presenters, novelist Peter Quinn, novelist Mary Gordon, and Professor Kerri Walsh, Director of Fordham's Irish Studies Program. All of us have gathered here today to discuss and to celebrate the life and work of Bronx-born fiction writer and former Fordham English Department member Elizabeth Cullinan. Today marks an important occasion, the reissuing of her powerful collection of short stories, Yellow Roses, nearly 4 decades after the original collection went out of print. Bringing a book back into print is, in fact, like a little resurrection. When a writer's books are no longer available to readers, she disappears, not only from the current literary landscape, but often from literary history as well. It is as if the writer had never lived, never left behind a significant body of work, never played a role in shaping and co-creating the literature of her era and of our own as well. So it is a thrill, if not a bona fide miracle, to witness the republication of Cullinan's Yellow Roses, the first of 4 volumes of fiction by Cullinan being reissued by Fordham University Press. And it's a particular delight to mark this event here in her native Bronx, on the campus where she taught as a professor and where some of the stories in the book are actually set. Fordham loomed large in Cullinan's life, both when she was growing up just a few miles from here in the Park Chester section of the Bronx, and then later when she began working and teaching here. So in a sense, we're celebrating a homecoming as well as a resurrection. I'd like to kick off today's program by presenting some background about Cullinan's life and work, by reading a couple of favorite passages from the book, saying a few words about how the project came about, and then we'll hear from our three panel members, each of whom knows and admires Cullinan's work, and in some cases knew the writer herself. Afterwards, we'll open up the conversation for your participation, and we invite you to ask questions of the panelists at that point. If any should occur to you during the presentations, please save them for Q&A. And then we'll conclude the evening with a small reception, and the books also in the back will be for sale at a 30% discount. And we'll also be giving away 20 copies for the lucky first 20 people who signed up for the event. So we'll hope you'll stay to find out who you are. I have the list here. It's a surprise even to me who the first 20 are. So it seems best to begin with a brief account of the writer's life. Who was Elizabeth Cullinan, and why are we interested in her work 60 years after it was published and 4 years after her death? Born in Manhattan on June 7, 1933, to Irish-American parents who later moved the family to the Bronx, Cullinan grew up amid New York City's Irish diaspora. She was educated at Catholic schools, the Academy of St. Ursula, and Marymount Manhattan College, founded by the Religious of the Sacred Heart of Mary, where her imagination was shaped by a classic Catholic formation: nuns in habits, jocular priests, statues of saints, rosaries, novenas, morning mass, and meatless Fridays were the stuff of her daily life. After her graduation from college, Cullinan left her pious Bronx family behind to live and work in Manhattan. She landed a job at the New Yorker, where she worked from 1955 to 1959, first as a typist and then as secretary to editor William Maxwell. And eventually she began submitting her own stories to the magazine. In scholar Patricia Coughlin's words, quote, "For Elizabeth at 22, beginning at the New Yorker in Manhattan was a startling transition, a short geographical distance, but culturally worlds away from her relatively unprivileged and devout Bronx childhood." Cullinan's job introduced her to a new world and served as an apprenticeship of sorts, giving her the opportunity to type up and to pore over stories written by the best contemporary fiction writers of her era, including Bronx Irish-born writers such as Maeve Brennan, as well as American writers such as John Updike. Over the course of 2 decades, 23 of Cullinan's stories were published in the New Yorker and later would be collected in 2 volumes, Yellow Roses, the volume we have here today, and The Time of Adam. Her stories were reviewed and admired in the New York Times by distinguished writers and critics, including the likes of the great Joyce biographer Richard Ellman and novelist Joyce Carol Oates. These reviewers recognize her nearly flawless craftsmanship, her complete dedication to the ordinary, to sensation, event, process, and detail, and her remarkable authenticity to felt experience. To these critical observations, I add my own admiration of Cullinan's penetrating vision, her deft and timeless assessments of the human condition, and her often heart-stopping, always insightful, and sometimes killer prose. A key aspect of Cullinan's work lies in her identity as an Irish American Catholic, as an identity that is foundational to her history, her sensibility, and her artistic vision. The conservative culture Cullinan emerged from dominates the novels and the stories she wrote well after her liberation from it. The hothouse world of the pre-Vatican II Catholic Church provides the setting of her fine debut novel, House of Gold, and it haunts her stories as well, exerting its powerful influence in the lives of her characters. This is especially evident in Yellow Roses, wherein Cullinan chronicles the lives of a handful of heroines, young women raised in the Irish Catholic ghetto who venture out beyond their schools, parishes, and neighborhoods, only to find themselves living in a disenchanted world. As Cullinan's characters begin to move in a secular society governed by a saintless calendar of days, they inevitably find their assumptions about life and the worldview they have inherited to be out of sync with just about everyone around them. The challenges they face take a variety of forms, nearly all of them touching on the issue of embodiment and raising the question of what it means to be a woman in a modern, male-dominated world. Cullinan's focus on the initiation experiences of women is another hallmark of her fiction. In contrast to the books written by male writers who dominated the literary scene of that era, Yellow Roses was bringing something different to the literary table, a relatively fresh point of view. For these are stories that powerfully evoke the writer's own milieu, that of young women living in Manhattan in the 1960s and 70s in the throes of the women's movement and the sexual revolution. And yet, for all of their rapt attention to their historical moment, they simultaneously speak to us across time, fearlessly telling these coming-of-age stories of women making their way in a culture that neither recognizes nor rewards their talents, and that is, in fact, designed to curb their freedom. The conditions she writes of differ from those evident in our culture today in degree, but not in kind. Cullinan is merciless in her evocation of figures that dominate women's lives: the condescending boss, the negligent lover, the patronizing doctor, the smothering mother, the feckless father. Her eye is fixed and unsparing. No one escapes without judgment, including the heroines themselves. And yet, sharp-eyed and sharp-tongued as they are, the tales Cullinan tells are tempered by the virtue of mercy. This is one of many qualities I admire about her work and vision. Everyone and no one is to blame for the circumstances her characters find themselves in, reflecting the complexity of the flawed human person learning to come to terms with the broken world she finds herself living in. In addition, Cullinan's stories imply a generous theology, one which acknowledges the reality of what Irish Cullinan might term sin and the need for grace to help redeem our griefs and losses. I like the way the word sin came across in this microphone. I didn't mean that. Cullinan's fiction depicts the class of cultures that she, along with a lot of other women, experienced during her lifetime, the expectations imposed by Catholicism that women marry, bear children, and spend their lives exclusively caring for their families, as opposed to the aspirations engendered by the women's movement, encouraging women to pursue an education, devote themselves to a career, and enjoy the same sexual freedoms that men have long enjoyed, now made possible by the ready availability of birth control and later abortion. Cullinan's characters do not encounter these competing choices as abstractions, but as felt realities, and that we, her readers, are palpably immersed in. One of the ways this felt reality is made almost corporeal for the reader is through Cullinan's careful attention to the body and the physical world it is located in. Her heroines are remarkably attuned to their flesh, the sensations that it registers, and the ways it is scarred and wounded by the world. She depicts meticulously what it feels like to undergo surgery for ovarian cysts, to have a lover one no longer feels passion for, to receive shocking news of the death of an innocent child, to visit one's father in an insane asylum. It is this powerful sense of embodiment that teaches her cradle Catholic heroines the truth of who and what they are. I'd like to read a passage from her story, Sum and Substance, that demonstrates Cullinan's extraordinary ability to capture the mystery of human embodiment at the moment that her young heroine, Ellen McGuire, discovers it. Throughout the story, Ellen is dehumanized by the experience of being prepped for surgery, cut open and then stitched back together, minus a part of her precious self. She writes, quote, "There was a sense of existence having dwindled drastically, of having become an object, a slab of stone or a block of wood, something inorganic." After her surgery, and at the end of the story, Ellen's sense of the power and wonder of her body vies with the received Jansenistic notion that the spirit is more important than the body, a puritanical teaching prominent in 19th and 20th century Irish Catholicism. Echoing scripture, she declares with new hard-won certitude, quote, "The body had the last word, and it had the first. In the beginning was the body. In the body, the battle began. The body took the blows. Nothing was lost on it. Blows to flesh and bone, to the sense, the faculties. The body took them and felt them more deeply than mind or spirit possibly could. The body had its own insight, its own learning. The body might take its time, but the body understood. The body remembered." Ellen is forced to come to terms with both the fragility and the magnificence of her body and the mystery of being mortal. Previously, she believed herself to be in possession of self-knowledge, but she suddenly understands this was never the case. Being embodied as a woman, vulnerable and yet empowered, has taught her this wisdom, and the formerly submissive, eager to please Ellen breaks out of the role defined for her by her church and by her tribe. At the same time, even as Cullinan interrogates the faith that she was brought up in her fiction, she values the traditions that have been passed on to her, even as she chafes against them. In another powerful epiphany in the book, Constance, the heroine in the story Life After Death, attends evening mass in Manhattan, and she experiences a visionary moment afterwards as she steps out of the church back onto the street. I'd like to read this passage. It's a little bit long, but it's worth it. That gives us a good taste of Cullinan's storytelling and fine writing. This is on page 178 for those of you who might have the book in your hands already. It's towards the end of this story, Life After Death. She says, "After I left the office yesterday, I went to evening mass. I often do. I love that calm at the end of the day. I love the routine, the prayers, the ranks of monks in their white habits who sit in choir stalls on the altar. I go to a Dominican church, all gray stone and vaulting and blue stained glass. Since it's a city parish, my companions at mass are diverse. Businessmen and students and women in beautiful fur coats, side by side with nuns and pious old people, the backbone of the congregation. I identify myself among them as someone who must be hard to place, sometimes properly dressed, sometimes in jeans, not so much devout as serious, good-looking, but in some undefined way. It's a true picture of me, but not, of course, the whole truth. There's no such thing as the whole truth with respect to the living, which is why history appeals to me. I like the finality. Whatever new finds the archaeologists may make for scholars to dispute, the facts stand. Battles have been won or lost, civilizations born or laid waste, and the labor and sacrifice entailed are over, can perhaps even be viewed as necessary or at least inevitable. The reasons I love the Mass are somewhat the same. During those 20 or so minutes, I feel my own past to be not quite coherent, but capable of eventually proving to be that. And if my life, like every other, contains elements of the outrageous, that ceremony of death and transfiguration is a means of reckoning with that outrageousness, as work and study are means of reckoning with time. She goes on later to talk about stepping outside of the church after hearing the priest and all of the people in the congregation, quote, begging for pardon, mercy, pity, understanding, protection, love. By the time Mass was over yesterday, the sun had set, and as I stepped out onto the sidewalk, I had the feeling I was leaving one of the side chapels for the body of the church. The buildings were like huge lighted altars. The sky was streaked with color, a magnificent fresco, too distant for the figures to be identified. The rush hour had started. The street was crowded with people. Flesh and blood images, living tableau, representing virtue and temptation, greed on one face, faith on another charity or sloth, fortitude or purity. And there, straight out of Ecclesiastes, I thought, vanity is vanity, all is vanity. Yesterday's headlines told of trouble in the Middle East, Israel of the two kingdoms, Israel and Judah. Iran, that was Alexander's Persia, Egypt of the pharaohs and the Ptolemies. I love those ancient peoples. I know them. They form a frieze, a band of images carved in thought across my mind. Emperors, princesses, slaves, scribes, farmers, soldiers, musicians, priests. I see them hunting, harvesting, dancing, embracing, fighting, eating, praying. The attitudes are all familiar. The figures are noble and beautiful and still. What Constance and what Cullinan recognizes and celebrates here is the access to the transcendent that their faith provides, the larger context of eternity within which to locate herself and the meaning of her life. In addition, her description of the city as an extension of the church altar was a fantastic visionary description. The buildings as lighted candles, the sky as a fresco, and all the marvelous, miraculous, living human beings around her as static figures on a frieze or on a tableau indicates Constance's ability to see the eternal in the everyday, what endures about us as human beings, even amid the flux of life. This is, in fact, what Cullinan's stories as a whole do. They give us all, quote, life after death, as the title suggests, and all of us are participants in the time-bound and timeless dance of eternity. As the work of a Catholic writer, Cullinan's stories constitute a simultaneous rejection and affirmation of an ancient faith tradition, a both and rather than an either or, embracing a complexity that some might find puzzling, but most readers will find compelling and true. These are the stories of real people for Elizabeth Cullinan. They are hers and they are ours. For who among us has not felt the friction of living with contradiction? So given the excellence of Cullinan's work, its powerful appeal, and the recognition it received during her lifetime, it is puzzling why her books were permitted to fall out of print. She enjoyed a successful writing life here in the United States and also in Ireland. She taught at the Iowa Writers Workshop, the University of Massachusetts, and finally here at Fordham for 2 decades. After retirement, after her retirement from teaching, she moved to Towson, Maryland, to be closer to her sisters and nieces. And some of the family actually is here with us today. 5 years later, Elizabeth Cullinan died on January 26, 2020. The New York Times obituary summarized her successes and also gave some small hint of the possible reasons why her work may have seemed to lack the staying power of her contemporaries. Cullinan dared to challenge the Irish-American male tradition, in the words of scholar Patricia Coughlin, of writing about ward bosses and henchmen, larger-than-life political fixers, tavern social life, and father-son relationships. With quiet irony, but consistently, she resists assumptions that women's concerns and experience are supplementary to men's. Indeed, Cullinan's stories assume that women's lives matter just as much as men's, especially their intimate private lives, an assumption that was not likely shared by the vast majority of readers in the 1970s and 1980s. Happily and hopefully, we are in a different place now, in part because of writers like Cullinan who are able to recognize that her stories are the hot pursuit of the real, as Flannery O'Connor says, and they give us truth as compellingly today as they did when they were first written some 60 years ago. At this point, I'm going to turn the microphone over to my first fellow panelist, Peter Quinn. But before I do, I just want to say a word about this important role that Peter has played in making the new edition of Yellow Roses available today. About 19 years ago, when I first arrived at Fordham, I heard Peter give a lecture about his own development as a writer, in which he mentioned the work of Elizabeth Cullinan, and he described how much it meant to him as a young man. I had never heard of this writer, so I looked her up and looked up her books in the hope of obtaining copies, only just to discover that all 4 of the books were out of print. Not to be dissuaded, I ordered used copies. I fell in love with her work, so much so that I incorporated her stories into my syllabus and my courses, and I distributed bootleg copies or PDFs to students. Fast forward another 17 years, I was asked by the Journal of American Catholic Studies to write an article about a forgotten or a neglected Catholic writer. I thought, oh, Elizabeth Cullinan. So I wrote about her, and the essay concludes with these words: "This is Elizabeth Cullinan's legacy and more. It's time to reclaim her and re-see her work. It's time to get her books back in print." I passed the article along to Peter, who had been championing her work all these years, and Peter in turn passed it on to Fred Nachbar, the editor-in-chief of Fordham University Press. The rest, as the saying goes, is history. Thanks to Fred, thanks to the press, and thanks especially to Peter, the resurrection was accomplished, and Elizabeth's book is in our hands today. So it's really quite a cause for celebration. And so now it's my pleasure to introduce novelist Peter Quinn. He's a man who needs no introduction, but I will give just a brief introduction. Peter, in fact, just spoke a year ago in this very room at this very podium when he was launching his new memoir, Cross Bronx. So it's a pleasure to have him back again. Peter Quinn is a novelist and essayist, a chronicler of Irish America, a third-generation New Yorker whose grandparents were born in Ireland. Quinn is the author of the novel Banished Children of Eve, 1994, which won the American Book Award, a historical novel set amid the New York City draft riots during the Civil War. In addition, Quinn is the author of a trilogy of novels, Hour of the Cat, The Man Who Never Returned, and Dry Bones. All of his books, by the way, are available in the back, along with Elizabeth's. A trained historian who earned a graduate degree here at Fordham University, Quinn has written about the Irish in New York, including members of his own family who participated in politics and served as Irish American influencers in his book of essays, Looking for Jimmy. And most recently, he published his terrific memoir, Cross Bronx. In addition to all of this creative writing, Quinn also served as speechwriter for Governors Hugh Carey and Mario Cuomo, and as a chief speechwriter for Time Warner. So please join me in welcoming Peter Quinn.
I don't live up to that introduction. Thank you, Angela. I'm honored to be included in this event, but I'm not deceived. Angela, Kerri, and Mary are accomplished academics, writers, and critics, all highly qualified to comment on the work of Elizabeth Cullinan and a place in the canon of women writers. My qualifications are a matter of acquaintance, not scholarship, so I'll be as brief as I can, which might not be as brief as you'd like, then get out of the way. One caveat, I was a little, as they say in the East Bronx, verklempt when I learned members of Elizabeth Cullinan's family would be here. I'm speaking from that most unreliable of human faculties, memory. They should feel free to correct, contradict, or object to what I say. I think it was Yeats who remarked that our minds are forever shaped by the landscapes of our childhood. Elizabeth Cullinan and I grew up in the same East Bronx neighborhood in the same parish, St. Raymond's. The Lake Island of Innisfree, it wasn't. For those of you unacquainted with the East Bronx, it is topographically the least interesting part of the borough. A flat marshland that spreads west and north from the East River and Pelham Bay. It's devoid of any significant landmarks except maybe the Bronx River, which back in the 50s when I was growing up was mostly a trash-filled ditch. In terms of architecture, there was not much except generic apartment buildings and modest 1- and 2-family homes erected in the first part of the 20th century. Parkchester, where I grew up, is an exception. The Bronx twin of Manhattan-Stuyvesant Town, it was built by MetLife just before World War II. Both were racially segregated. At one point, Parkchester was the world's largest housing development, with over 50 red brick buildings containing 12,000 apartments spread across 200 acres. Unlike the haphazard layout of everything surrounding the neighborhoods, Parkchester was designed to create a sense of order. The tenants, mostly Jewish and Irish, regarded themselves as lucky to live there, and some regarded themselves as socially superior to those outside. Elizabeth Cullinan lived right outside, on Poplar Street, off Tremont Avenue. I know a family, the Hochters, who lived on the same street, which had the ill-paved leftover feel of an earlier Bronx. A family's house faced St. Raymond's Church, which was and is an impressive neo-Romanesque structure with elegant stained glass windows and a soaring marble baldacchino or altar canopy. In the short story, The Voices of the Dead, Cullinan evokes St. Raymond's, renamed Holy Cross, through the eyes of the housebound matriarch as she gazes from her front porch at the imposing facade. In warm weather, with the massive doors left ajar, she was able to make out the gleaming gold vessels, to identify each passing liturgical season by glimpses of the vestments, creamy white or violet or red, glowing like the blood of the martyr. And when the sexton had put out the lights, when the incense had fled, and the breeze and the flickering votive candles had consumed their own waxen hearts, she sat there still, setting up her prayers against the night. I have no recollection of the family matriarch, whose death is a subject of Cullinan's novel, House of Gold, but my parents were acquainted with her parents. My father grew up in St. Raymond's, and if I remember correctly, so did Cullinan's father, or maybe it was her mother. They came to mind in the generic way of hat-wearing Irish Catholic parents in the 1950s. There were brief exchanges with my parents in that polite passing after Mass way. My sister Sheila, a decade older than I, attended Marymount College. Both Cullinan and they were English majors and commuted from the Bronx to 72nd Street. A freshman from when Cullinan was a senior, Sheila had only a vague memory of her. I met Elizabeth Cullinan once, briefly, in the 1980s. I was with her close friends, Susan and Tom Cahill, he the best-selling chronicler of the civilization-saving Irish. They took me along to a cocktail party in honor of what or whom I can't remember. Cullinan was reserved in a friendly way. I sensed it came from a natural shyness. I wanted to thank her for her books, for the interest they had, for the impact they had on me. Instead, I spouted some inane generalities about novel writing, which she kindly ignored. We chatted briefly about St. Raymond's in a matter-of-fact way. Peripheral though my connection to Cullinan was, her influence was profound. House of Gold was published in 1970. I was about to leave as a VISTA volunteer in Kansas City. It was an adventure I looked forward to, especially the chance to get out of the Bronx, sure of never coming back. My mother had just read Cullinan's novel, a classic major at Mount St. Vincent. She was a voracious reader with an appreciation of the well-written. She had a problem with House of Gold, a big problem, not with the writing, but the subject matter. My mother saw right away it was a romantic that suddenly disguised depiction of a family's innermost tensions, emotions, antagonists. Irish Catholics didn't hang out the family wash like this, all of it, whether soiled, stained, or threadbare. How could she do this to her family, was my mother's attitude. Sometimes the lace curtains were as thick as iron ones. I took Cullinan's novel with me to Kansas City. It was a revelation. All my time growing up in the East Bronx, in all my schooling in Bronx Catholic institutions from kindergarten through college, I never encountered or heard a writer who inhabited these precincts and parishes, never mind wrote about them. My sister passed on her copy of talk among yourselves, do I get it? Trembling hands.
Not you.
I knew from my sister that Cullinan's stories appeared in the New Yorker, and while I wasn't among his readers, I was aware of its highbrow, waspy reputation. I was impressed that an Irish Catholic from St. Raymond's had the talent and chutzpah to earn a place for herself there. Years later, the writer Kathleen Hill shared with me the impression that Cullinan's writing made on her. For the first time, Kathleen said, I felt as if I was reading about my own family, reading about people who resembled my own Catholic family. While House of Gold didn't rouse any ambition in me to be a writer, it brought home the way nothing had before, not even Joyce's doubleness, that how you write is what matters, not what you write about. Wherever they are, East Timor or the East Bronx, whoever they are, good, bad, and undecided, infamous or anonymous, human beings are the raw material of writing. In 1978, after a long post-1960s existential hangover, after stints as a teacher, court officer, Wall Street messenger, and media buyer at a Midtown ad agency, I landed as a graduate student studying for a PhD in history here at Fordham. My sister passed on her copy of Cullinan's recently published collection of short stories, Yellow Roses. At this point, I rarely got around to reading fiction. It was a while before I picked up the Yellow Roses. What I read resonated with me. What I knew about the experiences of a young career woman was largely from TV shows and movies. Frivolous and fantasy-filled, they were of a piece with the sexist male biosphere of the 1960s. But the sensibilities of an ethnic Catholic reared in the far reaches of the East Bronx, amid the challenges and complexities of the secular city, were as real to me as a ride on the Lexington Avenue local. One story in particular hit home. Only Human is set at a wake on what is obviously the Rose Hill campus. I knew the people and places, the refectory that was like a cafeteria, the lounge like the waiting room at a railway station, small Jesuit with gray hair parted in the center over a face of a saint, the theologian who doesn't believe theology can be taught. I felt the small thrill of recognition, like when you see your neighborhood or street used as a backdrop in a movie or TV show. Though unqualified to judge the literary merits of a short story, I read Only Human several times. I always read for plots. That's what students almost tested on, right? That's what historians do, follow plot lines. But it was Cullinan's sense of language that grabbed my attention. Sentences, paragraphs, snippets, the way they were strung together, the way they rose off the page and created meanings beyond the meanings they already had. I copied out small sections, sometimes a single phrase, sometimes several paragraphs. I wanted to understand the magic as much as the meaning. It was a practice that became a habit and I've continued to this day. I filled notebooks with excerpts and odd bits of language. It's been my version of writing school. I won't exaggerate and say that reading Only Human was a life-changing event, but it made a difference. Before long, I stumbled out of academics into speech writing. I told myself I'd stay a year, then return to finish my dissertation. And then I got accustomed to that strange, unfamiliar sensation known as well paid. 1 year turned into 30. Writing for others stirred in me desire to write for myself. I started in the early mornings before my day job. I began with short stories, but brevity eluded me. It felt like I was trying to stuff the Chrysler Building into a broom closet. I decided to try a novel. 10 years and 600 pages later, I finished. Throughout, Elizabeth Cullen hovered in the back of my mind, her writing, her courage, her accomplishment. I recommended her to friends, editors, and other writers. The few who bothered to read her were impressed, but it stopped there. Her books remained out of print. Mary Gargan, a native of the East Bronx, fellow Parkchester Ray, and Marymount graduate, who's sitting in the second row here, shared my admiration for Cullinan, as well as desire to see her back in print. She also shared my frustration. It seemed the odds were stacked against Cullinan. The injustice of that neglect stayed with me. And then, mirabile dictu, I met poet and Professor Angela O'Donnell. She got it right away. She went to Fred Duckbauer at Fordham University Press. Angela and Fred made it happen. All that fails rises, Finnegan's Wake tells us. All that is lost finds its way back. All that is forgotten is remembered again. And so, by a commodious vicus of recirculation, here we are tonight, and I get to say in public what I haven't been able to say up until now. Welcome back, Elizabeth, and thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. What a wonderful reflection. I appreciate your kind words, as we all do about Elizabeth, especially. So we're really lucky. We have like this amazing killer panel today. I hope you realize. And we have Peter, and now Peter is going to be followed by Mary Gordon, who also is a person who does not need any introduction, but I'm going to give her a brief introduction anyway. Mary Gordon is an American writer from Queens and Valley Stream, New York. Until her retirement in 2020, she held the McIntosh Professor of English chair at Barnard College. The only daughter of an Irish-Italian Catholic mother and a Jewish father who converted to Catholicism, Gordon was raised in a culturally and theologically rich household. Her breakout novel, Final Payments, published in 1978, established Gordon as a Catholic writer with a strong commitment to feminist principles who challenged the status quo with regard to the position of women in the Catholic Church, a role she has played throughout her long and prolific career as a novelist, memoirist, essayist, and creative prose writer. The author of 9 novels, 4 novellas and short story collections, and 3 memoirs, among other noteworthy publications, are the books that I would recommend that you read. Her most recent book is entitled Payback, and she's currently working on a new book called What Kind of Catholic Are You?, which pairs Catholics whose Catholicism has shaped their worldview, but whose views are diametrically opposed. The book features portraits of influential American Catholics, including James Martin, Bishop Barron, Amy Coney Bryant, Nancy Pelosi, and President Joe Biden, among others. Mary Gordon has 2 grandchildren as well as a cavapoo, and we're thrilled to have her with us today. Please join me in welcoming Mary Gordon.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Is this better? Okay. Reading Elizabeth Cullinan is for me both a pleasurable and a painful experience. Pleasurable because of the fineness of the style, what Jared Manley Hopkins called the achieve of, the mastery of the thing. But pain because she so perfectly captures the mid-century Irish-American habit of mistrusting joy, the acceptance of begrudgment, the fear of taking too much, which results finally in taking nothing. My heart sank with remembered despair at her description of Catholic school etiquette in her story Dreaming. This is a story about a Catholic girl who makes her way to a settlement house, which is largely Jewish. It was very different from Holy Family, where silence and restraint were drummed in so constantly as seemed to prevail. In the opinion of the nuns, self-expression needed no encouragement. Noises heard in the corridor of Holy Family were faint, like the step of a solitary child on the stone stairs or on the wooden floor going with a message from one classroom to another. Or there were solid, heavy sounds, a whole class tramping up or downstairs, or reciting the times table, or a spelling lesson, or learning a hymn, bodies moving and voices being raised in unison, another kind of silence. If any of the children in the other classes watched, they were called eyes front, please, or who gave anyone permission to look up from her work? This story traces a young girl's change of climate from her parochial school to a settlement house where the teachers and students are mostly Jewish, where people actually do encourage self-expression, and to be told one is a dreamer is not offered as a criticism. One of her teachers says that the young girl is a dreamer. And the narrator says, this was a point the nuns were inclined to labor. Stop wool gathering, they said. An idle mind is the devil's workshop. The nuns spoke to Mrs. Lynch and told her, Kathleen is a dreamer. She's always off in the clouds. I was a teenager before I understood that being called sensitive was not a castigation, that there was a possible sentence, you are wonderfully sensitive, as an alternative to you're so goddamn sensitive. At the same time, I felt tears starting as I heard echoes of my own mother's voice. This Kleenex is brand clean. Those women charge an arm and a leg. Who is to blame? The colonizing British, the repressive church, the overlay of famine terror, famine shame, the genetic disposition toward alcoholism or depression, all of these and more and none, and yet the culture has survived, and quite often it has thrived, and it has never lost its color. To write about the Irish is to risk falling into several traps. There is, of course, the sentimentality. Weren't they brave? Weren't they daring? Think of all they had to endure, and they were always victorious. Or they were heroically self-sacrificing. They were Davids overmastered by Goliaths. The temptation is always to see them against a larger and always alien world, the Protestant world, which always has a leg up and that will not let them in. This is not Cullinan's way. Her characters get out of the neighborhood, out of the parish. They can be pulled back, but that's not the last word. In these stories, the women are their own worst enemies. I have to say I grow impatient with the stories of unhappy love affairs with married men. I want to shake her and say, what did you think was going to happen? You want sex. That's great. Congratulations. It's a daring act for someone like you. But you know this is not going to turn out well with this man. It never does. There's a kind of exhaustion in these stories, a struggle to hold on to the family, but to keep them at emotional arm's length, a tense necessity, for they are ready to escape, to suck the escapee back into the hole she has only just laboriously climbed out of. Sometimes mothers are loving, but they are of no help. There is no help, except for the visions that break through a larger luminous reality that offers only hints. But how lovely the hints, how piercingly valuable. If I had to choose what to name as Cullinan's singular gift, I would say it is an ability to combine a peerless eye for ordinary corporeal detail and a willingness to make large, abstract, and even metaphysical pronouncements. The combination is masterfully realized in her story, The Perfect Crime. It begins on a ferry. Nora, the central character, is on her way to visit her parents, who have a cottage in a vacation community. Listen to how delightfully she renders the problem of vacation provisioning. There was only one store over on the island, and its stock was limited and select. If you were shopping for beer, quinine water, bitters, cans of anchovies or sardines, or smoked oysters, salted nuts, pretzels, cheese spread, meat paste, soda crackers, sunburn or suntan lotion, or aspirin, you were all right. If you wanted milk, eggs, bacon, bread, butter, instant coffee, cookies, soft drinks, orange juice, hamburger meat, hot dogs, or dry cereal, you were still all right. But anything more, anything you could put together and seriously call dinner, had to be ordered from the mainland and shipped over by ferry in cardboard cartons that were always in danger of splitting or getting lost in the shuffle. In the course of her trip on the ferry, she sees an old woman in black carrying what surely is a cake in a white cardboard box tied with string. She was the ideal mystery woman, imperturbable as well as unreal, an apparition set up for the benefit of whoever was there to receive her meaning, which, like most revelation, dealt with essentials. You were born into the world, you lived whatever time you were given, and in whatever circumstances, you grew old and accepted it, and maybe even were grateful to be released from the obligations of having to please and to charm, grateful to be allowed to watch and be still, grateful to have a small outing on a beautiful day and to be able to bring a cake. As she walks to the cottage with her mother from the ferry, takes off her clothes and considers a swim, several images present themselves to Nora, and exhausted from her train trip and lulled by her parents' familiar kindness, images come to her through the window, adding to the ones she has accumulated to all day. There is the image of the man who delivers the canisters of gas and who looks exactly like Picasso. She puts all the images together and creates her vision. She thought of Picasso, of the magnificently cluttered rooms where he'd often been pictured, and of the stupefying inventiveness and proliferation of his work. She thought of the Madonna wrapped and oblivious against a prospect of some distant Flemish or Spanish or Italian village. She thought of the stately horseback rider in his ranger's uniform and his cap like a Canadian Mounties. She thought of Mr. Escapo. All these images were provocative, all disturbing, and in somewhat the same way. Resemblances, contrasts, contradictions, coincidence, anomaly, incongruity, ambiguity. The spirit that moves the world has these wonderful resources with which to confound us. We live at the mercy of that spirit, and the spirit lets us live by and large in ignorance. Unless you lose sight of it from time to time, you receive some exceptional reminder of your ignorance. Take Mr. Aleppo. He was like the brilliant afterthought, the deliberate clue that the legendary criminal genius leaves behind, the touch that can belong to him and no other. He knows, and everyone knows, that the difficulty will lie not in putting a finger on him, but in capturing him. And so instead of having to cover the traces, he can indulge himself, add some inimitable flourish. Nora saw him, this casual virtuoso, far from the scene of the crime, picturing that scene, sorry no longer to be a part of it, imagining what short work he would have made of the investigation. Something of infinite value is gone. Who's responsible? Who else? But should there be any doubts, let me call attention to something, a small thing and irrelevant to the case, except that it shows what you're up against. This Mr. Escapo, the gas man who looks like Picasso, yes, he's a familiar figure around here, but don't be fooled. Look closely and see him now for what he is, the signature of the master. But such raptures are anomalous in Cullinan's stories. Joy, even small pleasures, are to be feared as they are so easily lost or distorted. Better to renounce them on one's own before they are stolen or corrupted. In the heartbreaking In the Summer House, which is about a mother and daughter's journey to visit their husband and father in a mental hospital, the daughter Angela shrugs off the difficulty of having had to give up her plans to travel to Europe in order to bail out her family. She'd given up her savings easily because there was no choice. The dream of traveling vanished, and with it went the dream's responsibility, the obligation to be happy. Now, riding through the beautiful summer afternoons, she felt as free as she might have in Paris or the Greek islands. It seemed you could stay this way forever, that it wasn't the worst way to be, relieved of a dream. Once again, these large ideas are buttressed by a firm foundation of precise observation. The experience of riding in a too cold train, excessively air conditioned on a too hot day, is masterfully evoked. The air conditioning in the train was up too high. Mrs. Ganley got a headache the minute she stepped into the car, and her daughter Angela broke out in gooseflesh. Halfway down the aisle, they found a seat together, and Mrs. Ganley stepped back to let Angela slide in next to the window. There was no great advantage in sitting by the window. The glass had been hit, probably by a rock thrown on a dark evening by some poverty-stricken child at the lucky commuters passing over the city slums on their way to the beautiful suburbs this train was riding through. The rock had left a mark like a bullet hole with a sunburst of icy cracks that gave Angela the feeling that riding inside of the train in the 90-degree weather were one and the same sensation, like chills and fever, she thought, and rubbed her arms. As they approached the reconverted mansion that is now a mental hospital, Angela wrote, they'd hardly settled themselves in the cab when it was drawing up to the gates of an enormous white frame mansion, the old-fashioned, expensive piece of property that outlived its private usefulness, had to be unloaded, and was turned over to this good cause. The appropriate cause? Why not? After all, what house was safe or couldn't suddenly turn out to be some sort of madhouse? The visit, so hard won, so anticipated, goes badly. Everyone has done their best, but their best has done no good. Closing the door on his family, Angela's father tells himself. His voice broke, not with emotion, but with the strain of having to conceal from his wife and daughter what he'd discovered, which was that he couldn't wait to get them off his hands, but that in spite of that, and all the more shocking because of it, they were all he had, all he'd ever have in this world. Part of the sadness that is the basso continuo of these stories is the heroine's constant loneliness. These women seem to have no friends. They have families, they have lovers, but these don't seem to assuage the essential loneliness. I thought of another master chronicler of loneliness who also worked at the New Yorker, Maeve Brennan, both of whom silenced themselves prematurely. Perhaps the greatest sadness for me in reading Elizabeth Cullinan was to understand how young she was when she no longer published. Her last book was published in 1982. And this was a golden time for women writers, that brief window that lasted for less than a decade when people seemed to be interested in what we were saying. It was the cultural fruit that grew from the tree of feminism, but Cullinan did not want to call herself a feminist. I met her once in 1979. She was teaching at UMass Amherst and I at Amherst College. I was thrilled when she phoned and invited me to lunch. I knew that I owed her a great debt of gratitude. It was her house of gold that gave me the assurance that I could write my own novel of Irish American life. I could not have written Final Payments without her invisible presence behind me, the older sister who told me that there was a way. I told her of my gratitude and she seemed pleased. She was gracious but distant. And so I was surprised at the anger that flared when she talked about the women's movement. I understood its source. A lot of bad writing was going around under the banner of feminism, but a lot of good writing was going around too. These were the years when Toni Morrison, Maxine Hong Kingston, Louise Erdrich, Marilyn Robinson, and others were given an acclaim they would not have had 10 years previously. But I had no impulse to argue with her. I was only grateful. And I remember being sad for her when we parted. She seemed to carry loneliness around her like a thin, loose shawl of a muted color, perhaps a bluish gray, a light violet, a smoky rose. How good it is to have her work available to her old admirers and one hopes new audiences. She may not have been able to ask for what she needed, but we can thank her for what she has given us to satisfy needs which perhaps we did not know as she did how to name, what Conrad called that glimpse of truth for which you have forgotten to ask. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, for that beautiful reflection. And also, I think it's so interesting that we're all choosing different stories to read from. We did not compare notes, and we've all chosen different stories. And as I said, this is a killer panel, and I am now about to introduce the person who's batting cleanup today, who is Professor Kerri Walsh. Some of you may know her as your own professor in some of your courses, and those of you who are in Irish Studies in the Gaelic Society certainly know her. Professor Walsh is Professor of English and Director of the Institute of Irish Studies at Fordham. She's also the founder of Fordham's Irish Women Writers Symposium, a recurring event that celebrates the works of Irish women writers. Walsh is the editor of James Joyce's Exiles, one of the Oxford World's Classics, Joyce's Dubliners from Broadview Press, and the Letters of Sylvia Beach from Columbia University Press, as well as the co-editor of the Fordham University Press journal, Joyce Studies Annual. She's currently writing a history of the Paris bookstore Shakespeare and Company from its founding in 1919 to the present. So I'm very pleased to introduce my colleague, Kerri Walsh.
I think first I will start with a few little reflections. I'm honored and totally thrilled to be sitting next to people I'm sitting next to. And O'Donnell, who was brought back, and Cullinan as well, but these two legends of New York Catholic literary life. I'm on. So I'm just gonna say a few little words about what I do as a sort of fellow restorer of Irish women's writing and the joy it gives me to see Cullinan in print. And then I thought I would talk and read a little bit from the title story, Yellow Roses, because it would be good to just acknowledge that title story, and it speaks to some of the themes we've talked about today. So I, as you know, by day, am a James Joyce scholar, but really in my heart, I think my passion is the rediscovery and celebration and like revival of lost Irish women writers. And this is a tradition, the Irish women writers, I think the point that Professor O'Donnell made that citing one of her sources, that Cullinan sort of maybe missed her shot in some ways because she didn't resemble the things that people think of when they think Irish literature, like longshoremen or, like there's a tradition, a certain kind of experimentalism is part of that tradition. She's not that kind of avant-garde writer, a certain kind of masculinity, a certain kind of pub life. So she might have, not fallen into those things. But I wanted to just say that she really does have a tradition, and that all of the Irish women writers that I've been sort of teaching and celebrating over the past few years, first of all, they may have fallen by the wayside because of some of these prejudices, but they are as exceptional as their male contemporaries. They truly are steeped in the exact same tradition with the exact same exquisite levels of writing. So that's one of my takeaways. It's been they're not lost for any reason other than simple prejudice and missed opportunity. They all deserve to be there. And I also just wanted to say that although Cullinan is such an exceptional writer, she also just is a writer who doesn't belong to a tradition. And so I wanted to point out one moment in Song and Substance, which just thrilled me. She's awaiting surgery and she's choosing between two collections of short stories to read. And she's got a big Russian tome on the one side, Turgenev. And then on the other side, she has the short stories of Elizabeth Bowen. And I'm sure that the people here at the table with me know the meaning of that. And for those who may just be discovering that, Bowen is she's held to be one of the most exceptional short story writers in English. And her stories, especially her stories of the London Blitz, The Demon Lover, The Happy Autumn Field, The Serious Poor, are just masterpieces of the short story form, and they really capture the strange experience of going through the Blitz. Her stories set in Ireland, she was an Anglo-Irish writer, are just brilliant studies of sort of position of an Anglo-Irish person in Ireland during the Irish Civil War. And she's someone who's quite universally admired by literary people. In fact, just as a personal anecdote, some members of my writing group all put together because we all love Elizabeth Bowen and we consider ourselves part of the cult of Elizabeth Bowen. So it was extremely exciting for me to see that Cullinan too is obviously a big fan of Elizabeth Bowen. So she's alluding to her Irish sort of literary feminist heritage there in an exciting way. And then in terms of people who came after Cullinan, I just wanted to mention two writers who I think you could think about her beside. One is Anne Enright. And I think about Anne Enright's 3 Stories About Love, one of her short stories that I teach often. And it has the same kind of bittersweet tone and kind of study of Catholic women who, the sort of theme of renunciation and just like living less life, accepting less, sort of acceptance of sacrifice is, I think, pretty strong in Anne Enright. And I even think the sort of blockbuster writer of the last decade, Sally Rooney, there's a lot that you can see in common there. For instance, in Beautiful World, Where Are You? There is even this kind of resurgence of a Catholic theme as some of the characters, against all the kind of secularism of modern Dublin, quietly start going to church and just keep going. So, and style-wise, I think there's a lot in common between Rooney and Cullinan as well. So I really just wanted to emphasize with that I really do see her as belonging to the tradition that I've been working in for the past decade, and that there are so many exciting Irish women writers to read if you get, and Irish American women writers to read if you get on this path. And so I thought the final thing I would do is just read you a little bit of Yellow Roses. And this gets right to the heart of the theme that, the frustrating theme of her feeling about these relationships with married men that she often depicts, and being the other woman or being the mistress. And so the title story is about a woman who is visited by a man with whom she's been having an affair for many years. His name is Charlie, her name is Louise, and he's married, and they were colleagues together in the literary world. And she says they're cronies as much as lovers. They're just really in each other's lives. And he shows up after they've had another tryst. He shows up a week later with yellow roses. And at first she's, she withholds her emotion while she's meeting with him. But then when he leaves, she's quite upset about the yellow roses, and she ends up throwing them in the garbage. So I'll just read you this passage. Louise turned away from the window, picked up the ashtray from the cracked table, emptied it into the trash, and put it back on the mantel. The roses were beginning to open out. She put her face to them. What a satisfying gesture it was to give flowers. How beautiful and natural, and yet somehow self-indulgent. Giving flowers was like giving a certain kind of love, the kind you can spare. The effect of the gift is out of all proportion to what goes into it. Coldly, angrily, she lifted the roses from their pitcher, brought them behind the counter, and stuck them headfirst into the trash. A thorn pricked her. A tiny red gash showed up on her thumb. And I should probably flash back for a second to say that when the lover presented her with these flowers, she said, "What's the meaning of yellow roses? We know red roses are love, pink roses are affection." And so she asked the lover, what's a yellow rose? And he says, "Oh, it's Texas," is the meaning. And so now the flowers are in the trash, and she's had a little bit more time to think. And she decides, actually, I'll read you what happens finally. Louise got up all of a sudden and went behind the kitchen counter. The roses in the trash basket had lost their dignity, but not their charm. They were mortified, but ravishing. She picked them out carefully. There were ashes and coffee grounds on some. She gave them a shake and brought them over to the mantel and put them back in the pitcher. Let them last, she thought. Let them last as long as they could. Let them last forever. She went back to her letter, and then there's a bit more. Louise looked up and was distracted by the reinstated roses. I love that. The reinstated roses. Twice as beautiful, she thought, for having been humiliated. Their fragrance twice as strong, their ivory yellow twice as fresh, twice as much of a lift to the sight and to the spirit. Eternal devotion. It suddenly hit her. That was it. She said it out loud. Eternal devotion. Red roses meant love. Pink roses meant affection. And yellow roses, Louise burst out laughing, yellow roses meant eternal devotion. And so this is a moment at the end of the story, I think, where we're asked to, on the one hand, ask if that's true. Do yellow roses mean eternal devotion in the cultural imaginary as we know it? But also, I think, to recognize that she has made a certain peace with the children, that she has defined the roses on her own terms and found enough peace with them as a symbol for the relationship that she can coexist these roses for stuff on. They're getting a bit wild. So I think I'll conclude there, and we'll start the question period. Okay, so I'm going to be the facilitator of the question period, and I wonder first if any of our panelists want to start by asking questions to each other, or should we go straight to the audience?
I just wanted to say Claire Keegan is another heir
Yes.
of hers, much more for me than Sally Rooney, I have to
Yes.
say.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I totally agree. Okay, and Peter, do you want to ask anything? Okay, you're the panelist, so you're not on the hook for this. I just wanted to always give the first chance to the panel to speak out. Okay, so we're ready for questions from the audience. So just let me know if you want to ask a question. That's true. Maybe I will ask unless Mary, you want
Yeah,
something.
I just, I don't know to whom I would ask this, but it's a question. Why did she stop writing or stop publishing? The 80s, I was there, and it would have been a good time. It was a receptive time, and she wasn't that old. And it just makes me sad. I don't know the answer to it, but it was oddly her time. Had she been able to seize it, and that makes me sad.
Susan and Tom Kail were friends. They were very close to him. And they said it was writer's block, but I don't know what writer's block is.
Yeah.
It doesn't have writer's block.
Can you say it into the mic?
Oh, yeah, I know these good friends of her, and they said, I was talking to them about why did she stop writing? And they said she had writer's block. I've never known what that means. I mean, every writer gets blocked for a while, but they don't totally give up. So it's not a sufficient explanation, I don't think.
I hope it didn't have to do with her coming to teach at Fordham because that's a full-time teacher I know. But that can hurt your writing.
I was intrigued by something Mary Gordon said, that you had understood that she was uncomfortable with feminism. So if you can tell us more about that, I would be very curious, because that's not something uncommon.
I think that the one thing that I know unequivocally that feminism achieved that we haven't lost is that women started to be more comfortable being friends with one another. And if you look at the literary world in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, there was always one woman that was allowed to play with the boys, like Mary McCarthy and then Susan Sontag. And the 70s and 80s, we started to say, no, 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 no. We're not each other's enemies. There isn't just one of us. There's all of us, and we feed each other. And, people like Grace Paley, for example, we're saying, no, we have to feed each other. And if we wait for these guys to tell us what's important, we're going to wait forever, and we don't need to. And I think that part of her one of the things that irritates me is, what was her first job at the New Yorker? She was a goddamn typist. And then she was Maxwell's assistant. And she liked the approval of powerful men. And I don't think she wanted, William Maxwell, if you look at who William Maxwell did not publish, Flannery O'Connor, Grace Paley, Tilly Olson. And I have a theory that when he took over editing Eudora Welty's stories, they become much tamer. I don't think he was a good mentor for a woman writer who was trying to find her own feet, she liked pleasing men. And that was a more comfortable stance for her than joining the company of women. And I don't think it served her well.
That I think there's just something very profound and sad about that. And I'm so happy there was that generational shift that brought women together. And I think there's also something in her aesthetic that is very subtle. And I could imagine, so many writers, from James Baldwin to, many writers, I'm thinking Baldwin because I'm reading him right now, or actually even Simone de Beauvoir I've been reading this week. They wrestle with the tension between politics and literature sometimes, it seems. And the writers at this table have such a graceful, integrated ability to think about literature and politics together. But I do think for some writers, there was an inherited idea that letting politics into your writing was somehow going to ruin it. That was like a mid-century kind of idea, probably related to like McCarthyism and all kinds of other things. But she may have had a bit of that sense of like fear of, say, if you let feminism into your writing, suddenly you're going to be strident and you're not going to be listening to the world as you should be because you have some preordained idea. Like, I don't know if you see that in her work, but I did sense maybe some of that shyness about political commitment.
Well, and she could do sad, but she could do snappish, but she couldn't do angry. There was a lot to be angry about, and you could do it in a stylish way. if you look at Housekeeping, which was one of the central novels of the 80s, there's no politics in that. And there certainly is a lot of style. So I think she was blocked because also she got older and she talks a lot about her looks in this story. She knows she's good looking. And God love her. I mean, great. She was good looking and I'm glad that she liked that. But aging, what is your relationship to powerful men when you're no longer a pretty girl? And you know, that's something that women can give you that men can't. Well, most men. Pardon
She
me?
kind of avoided powerful men, looking with lovers or people they're like middle class semi-losers.
Yeah, I don't know. But the people that at the New Yorker wanted to please them. Not me.
Well, actually, that is possibly another, and we have a question that I'm going to head back to, but I do think I want to say about the New Yorker in general in a career, that's a pretty perilous way to begin, actually, is if the New Yorker is your first, you succeed in the New Yorker, then I could see that in itself creating a certain kind of pressure that would be hard to live up to and hard to break free of because you're at the top. I don't know. I think a slow ascent is sometimes easier on a career. Okay, we got a question back here.
An unpublished novel. And I would love to see what's in that unpublished novel and it's autobiographical.
What stage of her career is it from?
Fred just left the room and he's the person who has seen it, knows more about it than I just know that it exists. And
Wow.
we would very much like to see that.
All these questions will be answered in the unpublished novel.
Thank you so much for having this. And what a great privilege it is for all of us to get to hear this conversation and to be with these writers. This is really fantastic, all of you. I have a question maybe for Mary and Peter about class, like what Mary talks about that was so beautiful how you described her work. And I remember reading it when I was doing research for another book to try to understand like the milieu of working class Irish mid-century. And I can still remember really physically, actually, the feeling of tightness in that family, like the silence, the overwhelming tightness and silence that Mary, you evoke so powerfully in your essay here. How much of that had to do with class, with this, respectability, right? This respectability of, well, we're not the Bowdy Irish. We're the right ones. We're the right ones who press our clothes before we go to church. That like striving to get into lower middle class or maybe aspire to middle class. Whereas so much of the other Irish literature that we kind of comes to mind stereotypically is working class, and it's frankly a lot more fun. So anyway, it's a question about class.
There's not a lot of Irish American literature. So, think about James Farrell. You think about Fitzgerald way back, but there are big gaps. So there's Farrell, there's Fitzgerald, there's Mary McCarthy, but there's not a lot that is considered literary. So there is literature that's more middle or whatever. But I've written a lot about this, about how it was like what your mother said, or what my family said. I wasn't even writing about my family, but what your mother said, you don't show your dirty laundry. And that anxiety and the feeling that, if they find out who we really are, I think that, so, I mean, it's not just class, it was Irishness that they censored them. Yeah, exactly.
Coming from a very working class Irish Catholic family, that you also never promoted yourself. If you say, I'm good at something, they would say, who do you think you are? So that perhaps another reason we never heard about Cullinan and we didn't hear enough about her is she just didn't come from a background where you promoted yourself, and God knows, as I've gotten older, I've realized that A lot of people I know, they aren't the smartest people in the world, but they're really good at that, you know? And
After I published my first novel, I didn't hear from my mother, and I didn't hear from her. So I called her up, and she said, I said, what did you think? And she had read it. She said, it's a little strange to reach 80 and find out you have a son with a pornographic imagination. And then I said, it's not pornographic, but she couldn't be convinced otherwise. But that was, I think most parents now, they'd celebrate something like that. But as Bishop Mary just said about Irish novelists, the best sports writers in the United States for generations were Irish Americans. But literature was not something they were interested in.
Now, my mother, when I published my first novel, she took it to the pastor and said, did my daughter write a dirty book? Like, what was in there?
Yeah.
You know, there was no. Then I found all these letters that my mother wrote that I never saw where she was bragging about me. But God forbid, she actually once said to my husband, you know, my daughter's the third best writer in America. What? Who was 1 and 2, you know, and why? So if you said she was the best, that would be getting a swell hit. But if I was the third, that was okay. I don't know. Probably Earl Stanley Gardner. But
Mother also said, which is great Irish American, what will my friends think?
yes,
I said, well, there are only 2 left and Marion is blind, so I wouldn't really worry about it.
I would just say this is also very paradoxical because on the one hand, you have this sort of denigration of ambition and the sense that you can't air dirty laundry, but the tradition still always has within it a great value placed on storytelling. That's a strange paradox that might, I don't know, it might be something about the difference between Irish and Irish American writing, but I've spent most of my life studying Irish writing, and no matter how self-deprecating, it also seems that there is a certain importance to learning how to tell a story and to shaping memory.
but don't tell it outside the parish.
Yeah. And don't say certain things, certain lines that you're not allowed to cross with sexuality. Yeah, don't talk about yourself. Yeah. Yes, you have a place, an official place to go. So you don't have to put it in the street. You can put it in the confession booth. Any further questions in the audience? No further questions in the audience. Well, then, having received the wonderful questions we've gotten so far, it seems like a good time to pause and move to reception. Thank our wonderful speakers one more time.
And before we move to the reception, I'd like to announce the names of those who have the books. So I hope I pronounce these names correctly. That way, when you go back to the table, you can just say, I am he or she. So here are our lists of people who are people who are getting a free book. Bob Abate, is Bob here? Okay, no, okay. Maybe there'll be another. Alice Alexio. Is Alice here? Yeah, Alice, you have a free book. Jemima Atanasio. Jemima here? Jemima? Okay. Tom Abra Byrne. No. Bernadette Cullen. Jack Doyle. Okay. Caitlin Duffy. Mary Erler. I didn't see Mary here. Chris Grocky. Thomas Massaro. Bill Garvey, McGarvey. I didn't see Bill here either. Okay. Rich Miller Murphy. Jennifer Mormon. Michelle Mogan. Yay! Ali Nouri. Maureen Ocasio. Julia Quinn. Marion Ronan. Francie Scanlon. and Allison Small. And I know somebody's here who knows Allison who might be able to take her book for her. So yes, you guys get to claim a free book in the back. Please help yourself to our reception, which consists of Irish soda bread and Italian cookies. We're in the Bronx, right? So please enjoy, and thank you everyone for coming this evening. And thanks to our great panelists.